Hello, everyone. I'd like to play devil's advocate here. Now, although I disagree, currently at least, that a anarcho-capitalist society or a setup or a civilization is feasible for the human species. As promised, I was going to make a video detailing some of the advancements that could occur, that could possibly, potentially, lead up to an anarcho-capitalist state, or at the very least create an environment that's conducive to it. The question, of course, that we should be exploring is whether or not human beings have an affinity at all for this kind of setup. And it's a question that I think is worth exploring because absolutely it would be a great thing to get rid of the state, to not have to depend on the state, to have a civilization set up so that we didn't have to depend on a nation state dictating to us what we can and can't do. Taxation, of course, is a big problem. I think it's necessary, but it's a big problem. Because it is the redistribution of wealth. I think that as of right now, we can't set up our society and civilization without that redistribution of wealth. But let's explore then what is the possibility? How can we start moving away from this dependency on the state? How can we start setting up systems that are, of course, voluntary, that do not require the state pointing a gun at you and saying, "Give me money"? There's an interesting channel on YouTube. I think the name of the channel is Motherboard. And it's very similar to Vice. It's kind of like these short documentary clips that take a foray, if you will, into some part of the world that people in the West, specifically here in America, are a lot less likely to venture into. Places like Afghanistan, Cuba, war zones, and the like. And so they give you these 20, 30-minute clips that kind of delve into the life of somebody living in one of these places so that you can kind of experience life through their eyes without actually having to take the risk of going there. But an interesting video that they made on Cuba specifically was talking about how the embargo that the United States imposed on Cuba created a culture because of the mass exodus of U.S. engineers and technology and talent and goods and services from Cuba. This created a culture of kind of DIY enthusiasts, people that had to work with the outdated technologies that they had and make do and create working innovations that allowed them to at least have some sort of semblance of keeping up with the Western explosion of technology that was going on all around them. Now, of course, they didn't keep up, right? The people in Cuba didn't keep up. But there was an interesting DIY culture fueling a kind of makeshift hodgepodge deluge of innovation that allowed them to lead a somewhat normal life. The embargo didn't stop these people from needing washing machines, right? So they had to figure out how to not only maintain washing machines, but take the parts that were unnecessary out of washing machines and use them in other life hacks. So I think these are very interesting areas that we should be exploring. Places where artificial conditions, or even natural conditions, but specifically artificial scarcity and artificial conditions like, for example, an embargo placed on the Cuban citizenry, created a situation where people had to stop looking towards the government and innovate themselves out of what could have been an unbearable standard of living. We have to pay attention to people that innovate themselves out of poverty. And with that said, there's also an interesting article on CNN talking about the rise of the tent city, or the re-rise, I guess, of the tent city in America. This is tragic, of course, and we have to change this. Homelessness has to be addressed in general, I think, before this country can progress. But these communities springing up in the United States are full of people that constitute populations that are ripe for creating the conditions that function as breeding grounds for what an anarcho-capitalist state could or would possibly look like. The interesting thing that they mention in this article is that some of these tent cities, some of these tent communities have high level of variation in how they organize their society. Some of them resemble the government setup, the nation state setup, with rigid rules and taxation and their own currency and all of that, and their own defense forces. And I really wish we could get in contact with some of these people and interview them and see how their systems of government are being put into place, because this is a population that really is insulated from the wider federal government. And of course, this isn't a pure anarcho-capitalist setup or the breeding ground for it, because it's taking place within a nation state, of course, the nation state of the United States of America, but it's certainly as close as we're going to get. So we need to start looking at these tent cities that perhaps have a free for all, anarcho-capitalist setup where there's no rules, where people just kind of do whatever it is they want so long as they don't interfere with everybody else's ability to do the same. And we need to see how their systems of economy, how their systems of commerce, how their systems of barter and trade, if they have them, have progressed in the more rigid societies and how they've progressed in the more free-for-all societies. And we need to analyze that, right? Because where else are we going to get opportunities to do things like this? It was mentioned in the article about the DIY culture that it was popping up around Cuba, that you could almost see how the environment, the different regions of Cuba, produced these DIY innovations based on the geographic and environmental conditions surrounding them. And this is what I think we need to be looking at, is how human systems are affected by technological innovations and how the environment around the populace creating these technological innovations is affected, how the technology that's created is affected by the environment around us. There's a famous saying that necessity is the mother of invention. And so we have to look at how our civilization is structured in this nation state setup that we most likely, very likely, have a natural affinity towards as human beings. And we need to start looking at how we're going to develop innovations that might allow us to break away from our dependency on this nation state setup that we do, I think, have an affinity towards and and gravitate towards. So how are we going to do that? Well, I think several key innovations have to take place. Government, of course, has its tendrils, has control over, and in my opinion, necessarily has control over things like emergency response, things like food and resource allocation, things like taxation, things like mass communication. The government has some degree of control over all of these facets of society, and these are the most important, in my opinion, facets of society to attack if we were going to dismantle, so to speak, our dependency on the state. You've seen the advent of 3D printable weapons, 3D printable guns and munitions, and this is an entrepreneur, I believe it started with, who learned SolidWorks and learned a bit about tensile strengths and a bit about physics and started designing his own weapons, and the state kind of threw a fit, right? Then they moved to ban these weapons, and frankly, I don't really know what's going on with it right now, but with the advent of 3D printing, of course, it allows for the emergence of what you can call, I guess, a backyard engineer. So long as you know a tiny bit about calculus and a little bit about SolidWorks and AutoCAD, you can manufacture some pretty in-depth, technologically advanced creations, right? And whereas before, you needed a manufacturing facility, right, that you had to pay to manufacture the prototypical part that you're offering up to them. And they need to punch that out with a punch press. They need to bend it up with a press brake. They need to mill it. They need to grind it. They need to lathe it, or whatever it is that they need to do. And all of that is very expensive. And of course, the sheet metal that you use, whether it be copper or stainless steel or galvanized steel or aluminum, it's all very expensive. Or cold rolled steel. I mean, this is all very expensive to manufacture. It's all very expensive to buy outright. But now we have the innovation of 3D printing that allows for things like printing out with much cheaper materials, non-metallic materials first, so that you can test your prototype, allowing you to work the kinks out, so to speak, and then maybe you only have to pay for one prototype part at a manufacturing facility, right? So that vastly decreases the amount that the quote backyard engineer has to invest in bringing his prototypical goods from drafting paper or AutoCAD to reality. And that's a great innovation. And I think that'll serve us very well in the future. And there's no reason why I think people can't start making significantly advanced weaponry and this is a thought experiment. This is merely a thought experiment being carried out to its logical conclusion. I am not advocating violence here, but I see no reason why in the future these backyard engineers could develop some significantly advanced weaponry. And we don't have to match the U.S. government or Western government's weaponry capabilities. We don't have to match them. We just have to make potent enough weaponry ubiquitous, right? We're talking about the most advanced military in the world, the most technologically developed military in the world, the most numerous military in the world, the American military. And look at the problems that they had with invading Afghanistan and Iraq, where everybody has some kind of automatic weapon or AK or a Kalashnikov or something, right? And there's the famous quote, some Japanese military general saying that if he ever invaded America, this was, I believe, in World War II, and I'm paraphrasing heavily here, but the famous quote goes that if he was to ever invade America, he would be confronted with a gun behind every blade of grass. The key is, if we're going to do away with the state, the key is to make the methods by which they control us, is to make systems that battle and counteract those methods ubiquitous in the hands of the everyday citizen. It's not just military defense that and make no mistake about it, for the anarcho-capitalists and the libertarians that believe that we're going to do away with the state. I'm sorry to have to burst your bubble here, but you're going to have to consider armed combat with the United States military. Right? If you're not considering armed combat with the United States military, and again, I'm not advocating violence of any sort against the United States military, I'm simply saying this is what it would take. So for these libertarians that think we're just going to vote the state out of existence, it's a bit of an oxymoron, isn't it? Right? It's the jumbo shrimp of libertarian philosophy. It's not going to happen. If you want to get rid of the state, you're going to have to force them to abdicate. But with that said, it's not just military advancement. Right, it's again, it's how are we going to develop systems of resource disbursement? How are we going to address the energy needs of a growing anarcho-capitalist civilization or state in its infancy? How are people going to depend as little as possible on whatever socialized services may be implemented at that point? Because you're not going to go, I mean, let's face it, you're not going to go from depending on a government or a nation state to zero wealth redistribution overnight. It's going to have to be a gradual phasing down. If it's possible or feasible at all, it's going to be gradual. I think one of the most important advents in recent history is the explosion of do-it-yourself gardening and aquaponics and things of that nature, where you can produce food in a much lower volume of space using much less resources, much less water. This is going to be very popular, I think, in the future. With all that said, I wanted to introduce you guys to an interesting technology that I think really is going to revolutionize government control over food. As many of you know, there's been all sorts of controversy surrounding GMO foods, genetically modified organisms, and the use of pesticides, and whether or not your food is organic. And of course, you never actually really know what you're buying. And I think that this innovation, this invention, is going to change all that. And what I'm talking about is a technology called, I believe the name of it is Scion. I never know how you pronounce that word, but this is a technology that uses infrared spectrometer, or perhaps, I guess a better way of putting it is a cloud storage attached to an infrared spectrometer with a portable device that allows you to scan fruits and vegetables and wine and meat and poultry. And this portable device scans data, I think, to an infrared spectroscopy database that they have on their end. And this tells you everything that you need to know about the fruit you're consuming, the meat you're consuming, the poultry you're consuming. And I think it's really amazing. I mean, they launched a Kickstarter. On this. And if any of you have taken organic chemistry, you know about infrared spectroscopy and about how every organic compound contains its own functional groups, whether or not there's a nitrogen attached to a carbon, and primary and secondary and tertiary carbons, and bromine groups and leaving groups. If you've taken organic chemistry, you know a lot about this, and you know that you did several lab exercises where you had to take, for example, a grapefruit, isolate the limonene. And I actually distinctly remember when I took Organic Chemistry 1, that me and my friend both got our grapefruit when we were doing the experiment where you extract limonene from a grapefruit. We both got our grapefruit from some mom and pop store, whereas everybody else went to Walmart or their local supermarket for their grapefruit. And you could clearly see when we extracted our product and we ran it through the infrared spectroscopy machine, which gives you peaks that correlate to these functional groups, where hydroxide is. You get a bump, I think, if I remember correctly from my organic chemistry days, you get a bump at 1700 nanometers when you have a ketone present, which is just an oxygen double bonded to a cyclohexane ring, or an alkene or an alkane or whatever. So this technology, infrared spectroscopy, tells you a good deal of information about the substance that you're examining. And in terms of food, this really could revolutionize things, because now we're dealing with an added component, an added level of consumer inquiry in terms of the food we ingest. Now we can start making databases with this technology to determine what blueberries, right? What supermarkets or grocery chain stores sell the blueberries with the highest amount of antioxidants. You can tell when your food is ripening to just the degree that you want it at. You can get a chemical readout of the food that you're processing and juxtapose it on top of the IR spectra for a genetically modified tomato, if that's what you're buying. Right? You can go buy organic tomatoes. You can go buy a tomato made by some agribusiness giant that creates its own tomatoes with its own poison or pesticide naturally excreted as the fruit grows. Right? And you can compare these two, and you can identify the differences between the two. And now you don't have to ask Monsanto, for example, to label its GMO foods. You can decipher that for yourself. So this is what I think the future is. Right? Inventing technologies that let us sidestep the state to any degree possible. And this technology, this infrared spectroscopy device, this portable IR device, has a Kickstarter up, and that's in the description box. And if you want to support that, I think it's important to support technologies like that. But this is what the future is, gentlemen. You're not gonna do away with the state by begging politicians to do it for you. I think the main conceit with libertarians and anarcho-capitalists and whatever is that they believe that the method by which they're going to achieve this stateless society or this minimized government is by asking politicians to minimize government. Well, politicians are part of government, and they have a vested interest in staying part of government, and they certainly aren't going to do away with their cushy $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 jobs that are way above the average pay for your average everyday blue collar or even white collar worker. They're not going to do away with those cushy gigs funded by the taxpayer. I think it would be silly to assume that they will. Another interesting article that I found on this topic was an article that talked about Silk Road, which in effect is a deep internet drug trade, black market of illegal drugs and even weapons. And Silk Road, frankly, I don't know exactly how it works, and I don't know how the authorities don't have more control over all of this, but apparently Silk Road delivers, in a free market, delivers illicit drugs to people that want to try them. We're talking about LSD, DMT, ecstasy, cocaine, all of these hardcore illegal drugs. And it delivers them via services like UPS and FedEx. I guess the way they do it is that the government doesn't have time, of course, to investigate every package that FedEx or UPS delivers, and doesn't even have the legal mandate to do so. And so they deliver drugs in this way, and so people get DMT and LSD and ecstasy and cocaine and all of these hardcore illegal drugs through this service, the Silk Road, which recently got shut down, I think, by the federal government. But of course, the beauty of the internet is that once you shut down one channel, a million others can open up, and it's this kind of internet-based illegal drug trade that's been going on. And there's an article making the argument that the existence of the Silk Road, this internet drug trade, actually lowered the crime rate that we attribute to drug violence. Right? So for the libertarians, this is definitely something that's encouraging, because it proves that less state involvement, of course, which is something that I believe in, I just don't believe that is true in 100% of the cases. But I think that less state involvement is better, and that if we were to legalize the drugs that are currently funding the war on drugs here in America and the world over, pretty much anywhere in the West, if we were to make those drugs legal, the violence would go down. And of course, we have instances in history like Prohibition to point to this as well, to support this fact. But it's never been really proven with these high-tech designer drugs like ecstasy, or drugs that take an experienced chemist to synthesize, like the hallucinogenics, specifically DMT. I think it's very interesting that they're making the insinuation that this illegal internet drug trade actually decreased the crime rate. So check that article out. And, that's all I really got to say for now. Hopefully you enjoyed these topics of discussion. Although this is a channel generally dealing with MGTOW topics, I do like to branch out, and I want to do that more often. So if you find these talks interesting, feel free to support this channel in any way you see fit. If you want to donate, there's a PayPal link as well. Thanks for listening, everybody, and I appreciate all my subscribers. Stay tuned.